Welcome to the Cash Car Convert Podcast, episode 25. I want to give this episode a little intro. This is one of the first episodes that I recorded, and in recording it, it had just a ton of audio issues. And so I've kind of put off editing this episode until I learned a little bit more about editing. And there's still a few rough patches in it, but my gosh, this is such an inspiring story. This is the story of Jen McDonough, known as the Iron Jen, and I thought it was very inspirational. So I wanted to get this to you. My apologies for not getting it to you much sooner than I have, but I hope you enjoy this 25th episode of the Cash Car Convert Podcast.
You're listening to the Cash Car Convert Podcast with James Kinson.
Hello and welcome to the Cash Car Convert Podcast, where cash cars are cool and auto debt is dangerous to your future. Today we have with us Jen McDonough, or the Iron Jen. Jen lives in Minnesota with her husband and 4 children. She's a busy lady. She's a motivational storyteller, a top 100 author on Amazon. She's an empowering coach. She's a great keynote speaker for overcoming adversity. A wife, a mom, a triathlete. I'm not really sure there's anything she hasn't done or can't do. But I'm also going to give you a little foreshadowing here. Her life 4 years ago wasn't quite where it is now. So we're going to get into that a little bit here as we get into the episode. I think you'll find Jen's story inspirational. I certainly know that I did. Jen, welcome to the show.
Oh, James, thanks so much for having me on.
I like to start my interviews with because this is a cash car podcast. I like to start my interviews off by asking people about their first car. So, what was the first car you ever owned? How did you come by it, and how did it work out for you?
I'd have to think about this, James. It was I think it was like a 1980 Ford Escort.
Okay.
And honestly, I love that thing. It got me from point A to point B. I'll be very honest. I know you are a car person. I'm not. However, when I met my husband, he was a big car person. And so I had my first car for, probably about 6-7 years. Absolutely love that car. And when I met my husband, we lived a very different lifestyle with cars. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, and I've given people kind of an overview of what you're doing today, but you've really had a really fascinating life, and I'd really like for you to kind of help them understand, your history, where you've come from, and how you got to where you are right now.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you for asking. Well, I've gotten to do a lot of fun things in my life. And when I first started out of high school, I actually started weightlifting, and I started with a broomstick. And that turned into becoming a national Olympic weightlifting champion.
Wow.
That went on to do some other things, including a short stint with women's professional football. And then I actually found myself doing the greatest role in life, and that was becoming a mom. I just discovered that, athletics was really fun, but being a mom is where my heart is. And so once I did that, I found myself kind of at a turn in life after we had a few kids, thinking, oh my gosh, what is my purpose in life? What is this? What is that? And so long story short, I went through kind of an overhaul and just said, I have to get back in shape. I have to, kind of bring some order to my life. So I started into running. I couldn't run 2 blocks, and I went on to run a full marathon 10 months later, which,
wow.
If you know about athletics, going from an anaerobic sport to an aerobic sport is pretty different. So that then led to going on to do an Ironman triathlon after not being able to bike, run, or swim. And taking those techniques, we really applied them into our greatest thing in life, and that was really getting our finances in order. So after I had done Ironman, our family was absolutely devastated to find ourselves financially and emotionally devastated. In fact, it was just 2 months after Ironman when our son was diagnosed with a lifetime medical condition. And so that's really spun our lives from being the top of the world kind of a feeling to feeling like, wow, life can't get any lower. And so we found ourselves really struggling with debt. We found ourselves being buried in medical bills. And it got to a point where we were standing in the grocery line one day thinking, oh my gosh, is my credit card going to bounce for the groceries that I have on there? So we found ourselves in a lot of turmoil. And I'm happy to say that after 48 months, thanks to Dave Ramsey and the support that we've had from people like him, we have paid off over $212,000 worth of debt, which includes medical expenses during that time. So we've had a lot of fun things, but it was really in taking the things that I learned and becoming that athletic champion to applying those to our finance life that really made our lives really incredible today. So
that's fantastic. One of the things I thought about as I listened to you speak there, it sounds like with your athletic training and background that that was something that probably lended itself pretty well, when you moved into the finances where you have to have that type of discipline. How much of that was leveraged from your athletics and, versus just kind of who you are as a person?
Yeah, it's so fun with athletics because it's fun to push your body. It's fun to see what limits you have. And it was it correlated so closely with what our finances, and finding ourselves in turmoil. The only difference was, I would say, is it went from being really a self thing with athletics to becoming really our whole family's life. So, while the athletic things that I've done in my life have been very cool, in seeing what we've done with our finances has been so much more rewarding because it's not only changed my life personally, but it's changed our whole family's lives. And it's been going on to change other people's lives as well. So our story's been shared in local news, national news, and we've been in international media too. We've been in a German documentary film. And so it's taking that same techniques in athletics and applying those definitely in our finance life. So it lended a great deal, I think.
Yeah, I heard you speak, and I heard you say that you hate running and you hate finances, but you love what it does for you. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. I think a lot of the listeners out there are probably much more adept at pushing themselves in athletics than they are in their finances. I kind of get the sense that I know I historically was guilty of this, kind of coasted along. I didn't pay attention to where I was in my checkbook. If I could make my car payments or my house payments, then I thought I was doing fine, not living with just a ton of margin. So I really appreciate how you link those two, and maybe other people listening to this will pick that up as well and feel like they can, leverage what they already know from athletics into their financial life.
It's kind of amazing, James, when we started, when we got to do all these fun athletic things, we got to go all over the country and stuff. People were so fascinated and they were so excited and they wanted to be a part of it. Yet when we found ourselves in debt, it was a very different thing. It was very shameful. When we started talking to people about it, it took a long time, probably about 2 years before we could kind of open up and talk about it because it was such a very shameful thing to have gone through. And instead of people being excited like they were for athletics, they were almost like embarrassed to talk about it with you.
Right.
It just opened up a whole new world, I guess, to see that, wow, kind of where we have our values lie. And sometimes it takes us falling on our face to appreciate really kind of the things that matter in life. And so now that we've come out with our story full-fledged, we've had the success we have had, it's a different thing. People are looking at us saying, well, how can we do that? But it was an interesting thing while we were going through it, the difference on how, people from being excited about doing these athletic things to being like, oh my gosh, we don't talk about finances. So I really admire what you're doing for people in kind of opening up that can of worms and just saying, hey, you know what? This is real life. Thank
you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that as well. And it is, a difficult thing to do. And I think what a lot of us like to do, and I know I've been guilty of this, whether it's success in personal life or athletics or business, we tend to look at people when they're at the top of their game and we say, wow, they've got it made. Everything went so easy for them. But I know from your story that wasn't the case for you. Right now, you're living what a lot of people would consider to be the dream. You're doing speaking, you're an author, you've got a podcast and a blog. I mean, so many things are going right for you right now, but it wasn't that way 4 years ago. Can you take us back to that time 4 years ago and some of the things that you did that allowed you to get to where you are right now? Because we tend to look at the end result and not the journey.
James, I think that is so true. It's so easy for us to look and see where people are today. And it's really neat when you can kind of look at those journeys to see where they came from. So thank you for asking. We, 4 years ago, we were a completely different family than we were today. When our family started our journey 4 years ago, we had just come off of doing Ironman triathlon. It was an absolute pinnacle point in our lives. It was the coolest thing outside of God and my family that I've gotten to do. 2 months after Ironman, our world completely crashed when our son was diagnosed with a lifetime medical condition. And we found ourselves not only struggling with kind of emotionally dealing with what he had. It was almost like a grievement process that we went through. But we found ourselves just being inundated with medical bills. And it got so bad at one point that I remembered standing in a grocery line thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have enough on my visa to cover what's on our conveyor belt. And it was just a very shameful, panicky, fearful situation to be in. So when we started our program, I'll tell you honestly that we weren't excited about it. We had, being faith-based people, we had prayed for a cure for our son. We had prayed for a pot of money to come our way. We just wanted our problems fixed, but it didn't happen. And so what did happen is a class came our way, and we ended up taking the class with a big chip on our shoulders. We weren't real excited about the whole process, but soon discovered that really learning about finances, even though it was humiliating, we didn't know anyone else who had ever had to take a class on finances. We found out that really was one of the greatest gifts we could have. It absolutely changed our lives. Bob and I were on very different pages when we started, but after a few months, thankfully, we got on the same page, and we just changed so much during that time. We not only changed the amount in our checkbook, but we really changed our mindset and how we lived. So while going from, becoming that athletic champion was really cool, going from where we were to where we are now in our finances is even cooler. It's just neat because it's affected our whole family's life, which has affected other people's lives that we go out to speak to, those who read our books or hear our stories through the media outlets that we're in. So it's been an incredible process, but I'll tell you, it was the most painful and definitely the most shameful processes to start off with.
Yeah, I think that's one of the toughest things when you go through something like that. And I've gone through those kinds of things. And some of that I'm starting to air publicly in my blog and I will in this podcast as well. And it's really difficult to get over that. But I think so many people live with that type of shame in silence, and they don't talk about it. And I think that's why, we see people driving new cars and we just assume that somebody driving a Mercedes is rich. We don't think about the fact that they might be in debt up to their eyeballs, or if, same thing with somebody in $1 million home or something. And so I really appreciate you coming forward with your story. Like I said, I know it was certainly inspirational to me. I want to go back again, sort of to the beginning of that 4-year journey and ask. I know one of the things Dave Ramsey always talks about people doing if they're struggling financially is taking on extra roles or extra jobs. Did either of you have to do something like that? And if so, what kinds of things did you do and to get yourself back on track?
Oh yeah. Well, when we first started our budget, we were $1,000 behind. And we thought, well, this stupid budget thing doesn't work. These numbers aren't adding up. Why is this so hard? It's money in, money out. But it's just such a change of mindset that when you are going from that person who's, not having a clue how much is in their bank account. I'll be honest, I only checked her checking account maybe twice a year, to becoming this financially responsible person. It's such a journey. And so some of the things that we did during that time is probably, this is the biggest thing, is our mindset went from, oh, I can't do this, we can't sell that, we can't take on the extra jobs, to starting to ask ourselves, really, what can we do? And that mindset, just asking ourselves that simple question of what can I do, changed our whole life. So we started looking at stuff of what could we sell. Well, at first we didn't see anything. But then after, looking at our budget and seeing, hey, we're still $1,000 behind, it kind of changes your motivation.
Right.
And so we started selling stuff on Craigslist like crazy. Then we started looking at our schedule and saying, well, okay, what can we do? What kind of jobs can we take on? And, James, if you would have known us 4 years ago, you wouldn't recognize us as the family today. So our schedule used to look like we had, we have 4 kids now, but we were on the go literally every night at some athletic event for our kids. Dinners a lot of time were in the car. We were eating fast food, or we were eating at the different, hockey rinks or whatever it was we were doing. But our schedules were so crammed that when it came to earning extra income, it was really kind of hard to see past those barriers. We all have 168 hours a week, but it's interesting how we choose to live those. And so at the time we thought, well, this is our life, we can't do that. But again, going back to that budget and saying, hey, we're trying desperately to find a cure for our son. We're trying desperately to get out of debt. What can we do? So we started dropping things out of our life. We said, well, what do we need to drop in order to gain? And for us personally, that meant dropping a lot of the extra activities that we had ourselves booked for, seeing that was a choice to do. And we started taking on jobs. So in 2010, even though Bob and I both work full-time, we have a 1-hour commute, we said, hey, this is what we can do. And we ended up having 10 W-2 forms that year.
Wow.
By taking on these extra jobs. And it was just amazing. And a lot of these jobs were between $8 and $10 an hour, which doesn't sound like a lot. And it was a very humbling experience to do some of these. I mean, I am 40 years old in my little hometown where we maybe have 3,000 people, and I'm on the sidewalk carrying a pizza board up and down the sidewalk. And I thought, you know what? I can sit here and be all mopey about our situation and think how embarrassing to be sitting out in front of my neighbors with this pizza sign going up and down the sidewalk. Or I can change my perspective and say how grateful I am to be earning $8 an hour. I'm getting exercise. I'm getting to listen to my podcasts. And I'm getting our family out of debt. By having that perspective, it really changed not only our income, but it changed how we spent things. So we started looking at things in terms of hours worked. And so instead of just spending $20 at at Walmart for things for the kids, we started saying, wow, that $20 is 2 to 3 hours of work. Is it worth it? And so by the time we got to looking at our cars, we had to kind of go through that process of working those jobs to see our car payments in that terms as well. And once we did, it kind of made us sick to see how many hours of us working that it took us to get there.
Yeah, I came to that realization myself a few years back, and I always kind of thought I was being smart because I said, I never want to have a car payment over $250. So, between my wife and I, our car payment was less than $500, but that's still a lot of hours of work for most people, and money that we certainly could have been spending on ourselves rather than, as I like to say now, helping somebody else build their future. I wanted to help me build my future, And wow, what you just relayed in that story there was so much goodness in there. I think the first thing that really jumped out at me is, you were willing to humble yourself and to do things that a lot of people, when they're in those situations, they stay in those situations because they're not willing to do those hard things and to make those hard choices, whether it's selling something that you don't think you can sell, or drive a car that's not as stylish, or do a job that you might think is beneath you, in your current mindset. And when you're trying to help your family and dig yourself out, I don't know that there's anything that really should be beneath many of us. And I hope those people listening will hear this. And you look at where Jen is now, the Iron Jen, and you look at where she is today. And this is a lady that 4 years ago was carrying a pizza sign. And she wouldn't be the woman she is today if she hadn't done that, I don't believe. Jen, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, this whole thing of discovering what our true wants are, and what our true needs are in life, when we can figure that stuff out, it truly is empowering when you can kind of face into our weaknesses to become stronger people. That is how you become stronger.
Yeah. So Jen, going back to the beginning there, what kinds of things did you look at to sell, and what were some of the real difficult decisions you had around selling things?
We ended up selling, in total, over a 4-year journey, we sold $20,000 worth of stuff. And honestly, James, if you would have asked me, do you have any stuff to sell? We would have said, no, absolutely not. But once we started selling stuff, so I think our first thing that we sold was a composter, and we couldn't give this thing away. It was a very cool item, but, people just didn't want it. But once we put it on Craigslist, oh my gosh, I think we had it sold within 2 hours.
Yeah.
And once we sold the composter, we were like, hey, what else do we got? We've got an extra fridge in the garage. Let's sell that. We've got an extra this, that. Let's sell that. Pretty soon, Craigslist became our absolute best friend. But the hardest thing that we had to let go of during that time, so like I mentioned, we sold $20,000 stuff. 13 of that was on a van that we sold, which sounds really cool. But we ended up, after we sold our van, we ended up still owing $8,000 on it.
Yeah.
And for my husband, that was a huge process, a learning process to go through, because for him, cars was a big deal. It meant safety for our family, and it was just really important to him. So it was kind of almost a faith thing to let it go. And if you talk to Bob today, he will say that was one of the most empowering moments for him, was having that courage to say, you know what, we don't need this. Let it go. Yes, we're going to have $8,000 that we're going to be paying on something that we don't own, but that just not only freed up our monthly expenses. We were paying $475 a month, but it freed up our minds too, to see that, you know what, we don't have to have certain things.
Right. That's a really great lesson for people. People they get caught up in this mindset of what they think they quote unquote need. And it really turns out not to be a need at all, but a want. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast and this website is to get people to shift their minds. And again, I want them to buy good cash cars that will, won't leave them stranded and won't put their families at risk when they're out and about, which is why I'm doing this. But, I also want to inspire them with people like yourself and these stories. And that's a really powerful moment. I went through something similar. I wound up in a situation where I needed to sell a car and I couldn't for a while. And once I was finally able to sell it, I went from driving a Lexus LS 400 to driving a 1987 Saab. And the funny thing about that was when I drove that Saab, I remember just feeling so much smarter that I was driving this cash car. I wasn't making this huge car payment month in and month out. And so maybe smart is the wrong term for you, but what kind of feeling did you have once you started selling some of these things and you started having what kind of feelings did you have around that?
James, I used to look at new cars and think, wow, those are really great. Bob and I in our 22 years of marriage, have probably owned about 60 cars.
Yep.
And so probably 10 to 12 years of our marriage, we had always had 2 new cars. So we would trade in our car every other year.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that was primarily due to, we have to have this. It's a safety thing. However, in looking at, what the expenses are for that, I mean, when I go out and talk, I'll give the Dave Ramsey example of the average car payment is $475, which that was us right on the spot.
Yeah.
And seeing that, hey, at a 12% rate of return after 10 years, that's $100,000.
Right.
And after 30 years, that's $1.6 million. Now, looking at it at that and saying, well, we had 2 new cars. How much, double
Right.
that? That was just astounding to see. But now, when we're going down the road and we see, 1990 Grand Am or whatever, we're like, wow, that car is hot. That is a sweet ride. But I'll tell you, what was kind of funny, James, is when we first started with our cars, paying cash for our cars, we started, and we still have, our vehicles have roll-down windows. It was the funniest thing to see our kids, because they had no clue how to get out of our cars. I thought, oh my goodness, we live in Minnesota. If we drive on a frozen lake and our car goes down, our family's toast. Yeah. Because my kids don't know how to roll down the windows and they don't know how to open the doors. But it was funny because obviously they did learn and they do know how to do it. But seeing their friends ride in our vans, they just stand there and wait for the door to open. It's like, no, honey, you have to open the door. So it's funny how generations go. But yeah, when we become millionaires, which we definitely will, there's no way that I ever want a new car. I still want to be driving the same cars that we have.
Right.
And it's interesting because Bob feels the same, whereas before we couldn't see ourselves not driving, a new Saturn or a new van or whatever. So that it's just interesting.
Yeah, it's funny how your mind shifts. And again, it goes back to having other priorities for your money. And I think, it's one of those things Dave Ramsey talks about, right? It's just the different mind sets between poor people and rich people. Rich people, they tend to think differently. So if you're a poor person and you want to, you want to be rich or to change your life in some way, find somebody and emulate what they've done. And, I'm going to tell you, the Iron Jen would be a great person to emulate. She's sacrificed. She's done a lot of really smart things to get where she is. And again, I think a lot of people will just look at the end result and say, wow, she must have been lucky. But I bet when you were doing those hard yards, you didn't feel very lucky at that point.
You know what? I actually felt very blessed to be able to do it, believe it or not. It was, it didn't feel like falling on her face at the time was a blessing, but boy, as hard as it was, as painful and embarrassing and shameful as it was, there wouldn't be anything that I'd change about our journey. It's just been amazing to watch not only what it's done for Bob and I, but really what it's done for our kids and how they look at things. That's
fantastic. Well, Jen, I really appreciate your time on the show today. You've been a wonderful guest, and it was really my honor to speak with you and have you on. I know that this message is going to inspire a lot of folks. Can you tell me where the best place would be for people to reach you?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking, James. Well, you can find us over at theirongen.com, and we blog several times a week. I also do a weekly internet radio show where I interview guests from around the country on different topics as it relates to overcoming adversities. And you can find me on Twitter at theirongen as well, or on Facebook at The Iron.
Perfect. And I would encourage everybody to go out to Amazon and check out the books that you've written as well, especially if they need to get a kickstart on their financial turnaround.
James, I just have to tell you one thing, and I'm not being cocky, but I'm just letting people know that we've had the #1 book on Amazon for budgeting, which is so wrong, because it was written by a person who hates finances, who just hates that stuff. But I think that's why it does really well, is because it's a simple, blunt book for people who don't think that they can do it, who just feel like there's no hope. And it's been an amazing journey.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you being on. And to our listeners out there, you'll find all the information that's been covered in this podcast at my website, cashcarconvert.com. And remember, buy a cash car and kick auto debt to the curb. Okay, and welcome back. Well, I told you that was an inspirational story. You know, I always try to distill down a few things from every episode to kind of have as major takeaways. And my gosh, this episode just had so much goodness in it. I'm really struggling. I think maybe one of the biggest things for me is just the way Jen and her husband humbled themselves and took jobs that most of us wouldn't be willing to take. And they did things most of us wouldn't be willing to do to get a result that most of us wouldn't get because we wouldn't do the hard things. They sold $20,000 worth of things from their house, things they didn't think they had to sell. They sold their van, which they were upside down on, by $8,000. And that's just wild. I mean, to be making payments on something that you don't have anymore. So many people don't have the intestinal fortitude to stay with something like that these days. They might have declared bankruptcy or something. And yet these people, they stuck it out. They did the things they had to do, the hard work, and they made everything work. I mean, they are so much better off as people for the lessons that they learned through this process. And they would have never learned them had they taken an easier way out. So this is just such an inspirational episode for me. It touched me personally very much. And I think it's because I related to a lot of it. You know, I have gone through some tough periods. I've shared some of those with you guys. And this is one that really hits close to home to me. I'm very thankful I haven't been in that situation where I had a child that had a lifelong illness. And so that's something I can't relate to. And I'm very fortunate that that's the case. But, going through those hard years and coming out the other side, feeling better about yourself and your circumstances, I think that's very powerful. And I hope that those of you listening will not have to be in that kind of situation before you start making those changes in your life, because you don't have to wait until you're at the bottom before you start trying to dig your way out. Seems like a lot of us have to get there first, but we don't really. You can learn from somebody else's mistakes. So learn from me, learn from Iron Jen, start taking care of your finances sooner rather than later. So with that, I'm going to wrap this episode up with my usual call to action, asking that you would go out and subscribe to my podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, and go out to iTunes and leave a rating and review. I'm very thankful for those people who have gone out and left reviews, and I'm actually going to call a few of those names out here, and I'm really excited to get an opportunity to do that. I've not done that, and I know a lot of people do that quite regularly. So I'm going to start with the people who left the first and earliest reviews from January. So I want to thank Alex Designs. I want to thank Justin Carper. I want to thank Money Plan SOS, Christina Casenza, Jennifer721, Beverly Vaughn, Wise Old Lady, EmpoweringThe80%.com, and NatalieBizChicks.com. So I'm going to leave it there for this episode, but I'm going to start leaving and calling out the names of people who've left reviews and ratings on my podcast, because that does help me get noticed in iTunes. And I've had a bit of a dry spell here. I haven't had a rating or review in a while, so I would really appreciate those of you who listen and get something out of the show. If you could go out there and do that. So thank you so much for listening. It's just an honor to get the opportunity to speak to you and to bring stories like the Iron Jen to you. Again, so inspirational. So I'll link up in the show notes her website, her Twitter account, Facebook, and links to her books in Amazon. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week.